Everyone's seen a Soviet tank. The T-34, the IS-2, the T-54, rolling across newsreel footage, parked in town squares, photographed on battlefields from Stalingrad to Berlin. You know what they look like on the outside. Cold steel, sloped armor, wide tracks. The kind of machine that looks like it was built by people who wanted to win and didn't care about anything else. But nobody talks about what was on the inside. And that's where the real story lives. Because inside a Soviet tank, something strange was happening. Something deliberate. Something that on the surface looked like a design choice so minor it barely seemed worth mentioning. The hatches. The interior of the hatches. They were painted red. Not the outside. Not the body. Not the turret. Just the inner face of the hatch. That part of the tank you stare at from inches away when you're sealed inside. When the armor is shut and the world outside is trying to kill you. Red. Bright. Unmistakable red. And here's the part that stops people cold when they first hear it. The reason had absolutely nothing to do with color. If you want to understand decisions like this one, the kind that look strange from the outside, but make brutal, logical sense when you see the full picture, then stay with me. And if this is the kind of history that gets under your skin, the kind that makes you see familiar things in completely new ways, subscribe now. Because this is exactly what we do here. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the Cold War. Not even the Second World War. Let's go back to the very first moment a human being climbed inside a tank and sealed the hatch behind them. Because to understand why that red paint mattered, you first have to understand what it actually felt like to be inside one of these machines. The year is 1916. The British have just unveiled the tank on the Somme. It's supposed to be a revolutionary weapon, a vehicle that can cross trenches, absorb machine gun fire, and break the stalemate that has cost millions of lives. In theory, it sounds like salvation. In practice, it is something close to a nightmare. The Mark I tank, the very first one used in combat, is a rolling oven. The engine sits inside the hull with the crew. There is no partition, no ventilation system worth mentioning, no way to exhaust the heat and fumes away from the men operating the machine. Temperatures inside the hull can reach 60 degrees Celsius during combat. The engine runs on petrol. The exhaust fills the compartment. The guns produce smoke with every shot. The noise is so overwhelming that crew members communicate by hitting each other. Not tapping, not gesturing, hitting, because you cannot hear anything else above the grinding of the tracks and the roar of the engine. Crew members faint regularly, not because they've been hit, because the carbon monoxide levels inside the hull rise to the point where a man simply stops being conscious. Visibility is almost nothing. The driver peers through narrow slits in the armor. Everyone else makes do with periscopes, or small ports that offer a thin sliver of the battlefield. And the tank moves at walking pace, slower in mud, and the mud is everywhere. Now understand this. Everything about that early experience, every single flaw and limitation and source of human suffering inside that machine, became the starting point for every tank designed afterward. Because the engineers and commanders who built the next generation of tanks had to grapple with a question that sounds simple, but isn't. How do you keep a crew functional in conditions that are trying to kill them from the inside? The Germans wrestled with this. The Americans wrestled with this. The British improved their designs generation by generation, and the Soviets, coming at tank warfare from a different angle, with different resources, different industrial philosophy, and a fundamentally different understanding of what a soldier was supposed to endure, came to some solutions that were unlike anything the West produced. To understand Soviet tank design philosophy, you have to understand the Soviet system itself, not politically, but practically. The Red Army operated at a scale that Western armies simply did not match. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union produced more tanks than every other nation in the conflict combined. More than Germany, more than the United States, more than Britain, more than Japan, more than all of them together. At the peak of production, Soviet factories were churning out T-34 tanks at a rate that bordered on industrial madness. In some periods, a new tank rolled off the line every single hour. And here is the brutal truth that shaped everything about Soviet tank design. At that rate, you don't design for comfort. You design for production. You design for quantity. You design for the simple, terrible arithmetic of attrition warfare, where your strategy depends on having more tanks than the enemy can destroy. That doesn't mean the Soviets were reckless with their crews. It means they were realistic. The average life expectancy of a Soviet tanker in 1941 and 1942 was measured in weeks. Some units lost their full complement of crews multiple times over. The question wasn't how do we make this comfortable? The question was, how do we make this survivable long enough to be effective? And that's the context in which Soviet engineers began looking at everything inside the hull. Everything. The ergonomics of the controls, the placement of the ammunition, the design of the crew positions, the visibility from each station. And yes, the hatches. The hatches were part of a much larger problem, and the red paint was part of a much larger solution. But to understand what that solution actually was, we need to talk about what happened to Soviet tankers when things went wrong. Because they went wrong constantly. Imagine you are a Soviet tank crew member in the summer of 1941. Germany has just launched Operation Barbarossa. The largest military invasion in human history has hit the Soviet Union like a wall of fire. You are inside a T-34, the best medium tank in the world at that moment, by almost any technical measure. Your tank has sloped armor that deflects German shells more effectively than anything the Wehrmacht has encountered. Your diesel engine is less likely to catch fire than the petrol engines in most German tanks. Your gun can punch through German armor at combat ranges. On paper, you are formidable. In practice, you are in chaos. The communication systems in early Soviet tanks are primitive or non-existent. Many tanks go into battle without radios, relying on flag signals, or simply following the lead tank. The training programs have been compressed and then compressed again to get crews into the field faster. Some tankers have logged barely a dozen hours in an actual vehicle before they are committed to combat. The command structure is rigid and slow, poorly adapted to the fluid, fast-moving warfare that Germany is imposing on every front. And when your tank gets hit, everything happens at once. A penetrating shell doesn't just punch a hole in the armor, it releases a massive burst of energy inside the hull. It creates spalling, which is fragments of the interior surface of the armor itself, turned into projectiles traveling at lethal speed. It can detonate ammunition, it can rupture fuel lines, and in seconds, a functioning tank becomes a furnace. Soviet tankers had a grim phrase for this. They called it the steel grave, and the statistics bore it out. The vast majority of tank crew deaths in the Second World War were not from enemy ground fire while outside the vehicle. They were from what happened inside the vehicle when armor was breached, or from what happened when a crew tried to get out. Getting out. That's where we finally arrive at the hatch. Because in the chaos and the smoke and the disorientation of a hit, getting out of a tank is not as simple as opening a door. It never was, and the Soviets knew it better than anyone. A tank hatch is not a door, in any intuitive sense. It doesn't open by turning a handle and pushing. It operates with a mechanism designed first and foremost to keep it sealed under combat conditions. There are locks, levers, sometimes springs, sometimes counterweights, and the specific sequence of actions required to open a hatch from the inside is something a crew member has to know by feel, not by sight. Because when you need to get out, you almost certainly cannot see clearly. There is smoke, there may be fire. Your vision may be impaired by a flash or a concussive blast. You may be disoriented. You may be injured. Your hands may not be working the way they normally work. And the problem the Soviets documented over and over again, through combat reports, through after-action analyses, through the terrible process of figuring out why burned tanks still had dead crew inside them instead of dead crew outside them, was this. Men were dying at the hatch, not because the hatch was stuck, not because it was damaged, but because in the chaos and the smoke, a panicking, disoriented crew member could not find the release mechanism fast enough. They knew it was there. They knew roughly where it was. But in the darkness, with smoke burning their eyes and fire beginning somewhere beneath them, rough approximation was not good enough. There is a specific kind of human failure that emerges under extreme stress. It's not stupidity. It's not cowardice. It's the way the human nervous system behaves when it is flooded with adrenaline and carbon monoxide and heat and fear simultaneously. Fine motor control degrades. Spatial memory becomes unreliable. The things you know perfectly well in a calm training environment become slippery and elusive when your body is in full survival response. And a hatch mechanism, with its levers and locks and specific sequence, is exactly the kind of thing that becomes slippery under those conditions. Soviet engineers and military analysts looked at this problem and they asked a question. Not how do we redesign the hatch mechanism, though they worked on that too, but how do we make it possible for a crew member to find the release point without being able to see it clearly, even in the worst possible conditions? The answer was tactile and visual at the same time, and it was something any factory could implement at essentially no additional cost. They painted the release mechanisms red, not the whole hatch, the specific point or points that a crew member needed to find in an emergency. Bright, high-visibility red against the interior surface of the hatch, which was typically dark, typically metal, typically the same color as everything else inside the hull. Why red? This is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because the choice of red was not arbitrary, and it was not aesthetic, and it was not political. It was physiological. And to understand why, we need to talk about how the human eye actually works under stress. Under normal lighting conditions, human color vision is reasonably good across the spectrum. We can distinguish hundreds of thousands of different colors, but lighting inside a tank under combat conditions is not normal. It is low. It is flickering. It is often compromised by smoke, and under low light conditions, the human eye shifts its reliance from cone cells to rod cells. Cone cells are responsible for color vision. Rod cells are responsible for detecting light and dark, contrast, movement, shape. Rod cells are far more sensitive in low light, but they don't process color the way cone cells do. Here is the critical piece. Rod cells are maximally sensitive to light in the blue-green range of the spectrum. This means that in low light, blue and green actually appear brightest to the human eye. Red appears darker. Red is at the far end of the visible spectrum, and rod cells respond to it least effectively of all the colors. So why paint the release points red if red is the hardest color to see in low light? Because the problem the Soviets were solving wasn't purely a low light problem. It was a contrast problem combined with a smoke problem, combined with a fire problem, and in conditions where there is any light at all, including firelight, including the light of something burning inside the hull, red becomes one of the highest contrast colors you can use against a dark metal background. Red stands out against gray metal. Red stands out against black carbon buildup. Red stands out against the olive drab interior paint that covered most Soviet tank interiors. And there is another dimension to this that the Soviets understood from practical experience. In conditions of extreme stress, the human visual system enters a state that researchers later termed tunnel vision or perceptual narrowing. Your peripheral vision effectively shuts down. Your depth perception becomes unreliable. But your ability to detect sharp color contrast in your direct line of sight remains functional longer than almost any other visual capability. You can still see a red mark against a dark surface, even when your hands are shaking and your eyes are streaming from smoke, and your mind is operating at the edge of panic. You can see it and you can reach it. The red paint was not decorative. It was a target, a tactile and visual target that said, here, this is where you need to put your hand. This is what will get you out. But the story doesn't end there. Because the red hatches were part of a broader system of design thinking that Soviet engineers applied to the interior of their tanks, and understanding that system reveals something remarkable about how the Soviet military thought about the relationship between a machine and the human being inside it. Soviet tank interiors were not comfortable by any standard measure. They were cramped. The T-34 in its early versions was notoriously difficult to crew effectively. The turret was small. The turret basket barely existed in early models. The driver's position required significant physical strength to operate, and the visibility was poor enough that commanders had to ride with their hatches open during combat, which exposed them to fire, but was considered preferable to being effectively blind inside a sealed vehicle. But uncomfortable does not mean unconsidered. The Soviets were deeply aware of the relationship between crew performance and crew survival, and they developed a philosophy that can be described roughly like this. You cannot control whether your tank gets hit. You cannot always control whether the hit penetrates, but you can control whether a crew that survives the initial hit can get out. And maximizing the probability of getting out was treated as an engineering problem with engineering solutions. The red hatch markings were one solution, but there were others that worked in conjunction with them, and together they formed a coherent approach to what we would today call human factors engineering. The idea that machines should be designed with a precise understanding of how human beings actually behave, not how we wish they would behave, or how they behave in ideal conditions, but how they behave when they're terrified and injured and half-blind. One element of this was the placement of escape routes themselves. Soviet engineers made deliberate choices about where to put hatches and how many to include. The T-34-85, which became the primary Soviet medium tank from 1944 onward, had multiple exit points. The loader's hatch, the commander's cupola, the driver's hatch in the front glacis. Each was positioned with an awareness of which positions would have the most difficulty evacuating under fire, and what path through the tank a crew member would need to take to reach each exit. The floor hatch deserves particular attention because it represents a fascinating philosophical decision. Some Soviet tank designs included or experimented with belly escape hatches. The idea was that if the tank was on fire and the upper hatches were blocked or exposed to enemy fire, a crew member might be able to exit downward, through the bottom of the hull, underneath the vehicle itself, and then crawl clear of the machine from a position where they were shielded from direct fire by the hull above them. This sounds clever. In practice, it was complicated. A belly hatch only works if the tank is not sitting on hard ground that prevents the hatch from opening. It only works if the ground beneath the tank hasn't been churned into mud by the tracks during movement. It only works if there's enough clearance between the hull bottom and the surface below. In the muddy conditions of the Eastern Front, where Soviet tanks operated most of the time, a belly hatch was more a theoretical option than a reliable one. But the thinking behind it, the determination to give crews multiple options for every scenario, reflects the same mindset that produced the red paint markings. There is also the question of ammunition stowage, which had a direct relationship to crew survival and escape. One of the deadliest hazards in any tank hit is ammunition cook-off. When a penetrating round or an internal fire reaches the propellant charges or the shells themselves, the result is catastrophic. The force of an ammunition explosion inside a tank hull can blow the turret off completely. The smoke and pressure and fragments give a crew almost no chance of survival. The Soviets were acutely aware of this. The Germans were aware of it too, and both sides made choices about ammunition stowage that were as much about crew survival as they were about operational convenience. Soviet engineers experimented throughout the war with wet ammunition stowage, the practice of surrounding shell racks with water or antifreeze to absorb heat and reduce the risk of propellant ignition from a penetrating hit or fire. The T-34-85 used a version of this approach, and later Soviet designs refined it further. Why does this matter for the hatch story? Because every second counts. The difference between a fire that gives a crew 30 seconds to evacuate and a fire that detonates the ammunition in 5 seconds is the difference between a crew that can use those red markings to find the release and a crew that cannot. Soviet engineering decisions about ammunition stowage and about hatch design and about interior markings were all aimed at expanding that window of survivability, giving the crew the maximum possible time to do the thing they needed to do. Now let's talk about something that almost never gets mentioned in histories of Soviet armor, the training dimension of the red hatch system. Because the physical marking was only half the picture, the other half was how Soviet tankers were trained to respond to it. Soviet tank training, particularly in the crisis period of 1941 and 1942, was often brutally compressed. Crews received weeks of training rather than months. The pressure to get men and machines into the field was so intense that many elements of thorough preparation were cut. But one element was never cut: exit drills. Soviet tanker training incorporated repeated practice of emergency evacuation procedures. Crews were drilled on finding and operating every hatch release from their specific position inside the tank. They were drilled in darkness. They were drilled wearing gloves, because tankers in winter conditions wore thick gloves, and a release mechanism that couldn't be operated with gloves on was a release mechanism that killed people. They were drilled under stress, sometimes with smoke, sometimes with instructors creating noise and distraction to approximate combat conditions. And the red markings were the anchor point of those drills. When a training instructor said, "Find your exit," the crew members' eyes went to the red mark. When they practiced in reduced light or with smoke, the red mark was the thing they had been trained to look for. It became a conditioned response, not just information about where the release was, but a trigger for the physical action of evacuating. The color itself became part of the muscle memory. This is a sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to military training. The Soviets were, in certain respects, ahead of their time in recognizing that effective training wasn't about teaching soldiers information. It was about creating automatic responses to specific stimuli, so that when rational thought was impaired by stress or injury or fear, the body could still execute the necessary action. The red mark was the stimulus. Finding it, reaching it, operating it was the response. The combination of the physical marking, the training protocols, and the design of the hatch mechanisms themselves represented a system. And systems, even simple ones, perform better than individual elements in isolation. But now let's go deeper into the history, because the Red Hatch story doesn't exist in isolation from the broader story of Soviet tank development, and understanding that development reveals why certain decisions were made and what pressures shaped them. The Soviet Union began serious tank development in the late 1920s. The initial designs were heavily influenced by foreign models, particularly British and American designs that Soviet engineers studied, purchased, and in some cases reverse-engineered. The British Vickers tank, the American Christie suspension system, these became foundational elements of early Soviet armor. But from the beginning, Soviet engineers adapted what they borrowed to fit their own requirements and their own industrial reality. The Christie suspension, developed by American engineer J. Walter Christie, allowed tanks to achieve speeds that were genuinely revolutionary for the era. Christie's design used large road wheels and a spring system that allowed a tank to move faster cross-country than any comparable vehicle of the time. Christie himself couldn't sell his design to the U.S. Army, which turned it down. The Soviets bought 2 of his tanks, technically as agricultural tractors to get around export restrictions, shipped them to the Soviet Union, and used them as the basis for the BT series of fast tanks that became the precursor to the T-34. The BT tanks were fast and innovative, but they had serious limitations. Their armor was thin. Their guns, while adequate for the late 1930s, were not going to be sufficient against the armor developments happening simultaneously in Germany. And their crews, even in the relatively early days of Soviet tank development, were dealing with some of the same fundamental problems that would persist throughout the war: limited visibility, difficult ergonomics, hatches that required specific knowledge to operate. The development of the T-34 in the late 1930s, under the direction of Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, addressed many of the technical limitations of the BT series. The diesel engine reduced fire risk. The sloped armor dramatically improved protection. The wide tracks improved cross-country performance. The gun was powerful enough to engage any tank Germany was likely to field. But the crew conditions inside the T-34 were in some respects worse than in earlier designs, because the design prioritized armor and firepower and mobility above everything else, including the comfort and operational effectiveness of the crew. The early T-34 had a 2-man turret in which the commander was also required to act as gunner, which meant he could not observe the battlefield while he was engaging targets. This was a significant tactical limitation that Soviet crews compensated for through experience and improvisation, but which cost real lives before it was addressed with the improved 3-man turret of the T-34/85 in 1944. It is in this context of a military and industrial system simultaneously trying to produce maximum numbers of machines while also improving their crew's ability to survive and fight in them that the red hatch markings should be understood. They were not a quirk. They were not tradition. They were a specific response to a specific documented problem, implemented cheaply and effectively at industrial scale, at a time when the Soviets could not afford solutions that were expensive or complicated. That is actually one of the most remarkable things about the red hatch decision. It cost essentially nothing, a small amount of paint, applied during manufacturing. That's the entire material investment, and the return on that investment, measured in crew members who found the release in time, who got out, who survived to fight in another tank, was real and measurable. Not in formal studies, because the Soviets didn't always have the luxury of formal studies, but in the simple, brutal arithmetic of crews who made it out versus crews who didn't. The philosophy behind decisions like this one, cheap, simple, durable, effective, permeates Soviet military design of the Second World War era. It reflects an understanding that in total war at industrial scale, elegance is less important than reliability, and complexity is the enemy of the soldier who has to use the tool under the worst possible conditions. A sophisticated solution that fails in combat is worse than a simple solution that works. This philosophy also explains some of the things about Soviet tanks that Western analysts sometimes misread as crudeness or simplicity. Early T-34 tanks had a notoriously rough ride. The transmission was difficult to operate and required significant physical strength to shift gears, to the point where Soviet tankers developed considerable upper body strength simply from operating their vehicles. Early hatches were harder to open than German equivalents. Interior fitting was minimal. There was very little in the way of crew comfort features that Western tank designs were beginning to incorporate by mid-war. But those seemingly crude features existed in a machine that could be built by the thousands, that could survive a combat hit that would have destroyed a more finely engineered vehicle, and that could be operated by a crew trained in weeks rather than months. The rough edges were the price of the volume, and the volume was the strategy. Understanding this helps explain something else about the red hatches that isn't often discussed. The fact that the solution persisted. It wasn't just a wartime expedient that was dropped when better solutions became available. It remained part of Soviet and later Russian tank design for decades after the war, through the T-54, the T-62, the T-72, the T-80. Interior hatch markings and emergency indicator systems, the direct descendants of those wartime red marks, continued to be incorporated into Soviet and Russian armor. Because the problem they solved, the problem of a crew member under extreme stress needing to find an emergency exit as fast as possible, didn't go away when the war ended. In fact, as tank design evolved, the problem in some ways became more complex. Modern tanks seal more effectively against chemical and biological weapons, which means they also seal in smoke and fumes more thoroughly. Modern electronics create additional sources of fire risk. Modern ammunition, while safer in some respects, creates new hazards if it's hit. And modern tanks operate in environments where the threat profile has expanded to include anti-tank missiles that can produce catastrophically fast internal fires. The red marking principle, always give the crew a visible, tactile reference point for emergency exits, evolved with the technology. Modern Russian tanks use a combination of physical markings and, in some designs, lighting systems that illuminate emergency handles during alarm conditions. The specific color may vary. The specific mechanism has changed. But the underlying insight, that you cannot rely on a panicked, injured crew member to remember where things are without a clear, unmistakable reference point, remains as valid today as it was in 1942. Now, there's another layer to this story that almost never gets told. The human stories behind the statistics, because the red paint was not just an engineering decision, it was a response to real deaths that real people investigated and tried to prevent, and those investigators had names and faces, even if most of them are now forgotten. The Soviet military maintained detailed records of tank losses throughout the war, far more detailed than is often assumed. These records included information about crew fates wherever it could be determined. How many crew members from a destroyed tank were recovered? How many were killed inside the vehicle? How many were killed trying to exit? How many were successfully evacuated? The patterns in this data, patterns that showed crew members dying at exit points rather than from the initial hit, were what drove the engineering responses. The men who analyzed those patterns were not politicians or propagandists. They were engineers and military analysts doing a specific, unglamorous, essential job, looking at why people died in order to figure out how to make fewer people die in the future. This is not a heroic story in the traditional sense. Nobody charges a machine gun nest. Nobody performs a daring rescue. It's quieter than that and in some ways more important. It's the story of people deciding that every crew member who died at a hatch because they couldn't find the release in time was a preventable death, and then actually preventing it. We don't know the names of most of these people. The Soviet system wasn't structured in a way that preserved individual credit for engineering decisions, particularly practical field modifications to existing designs. The red hatch markings may have emerged from a single proposal or from several simultaneous observations in different units. They may have been formalized by the Central Armored Directorate or adopted informally unit by unit before becoming standard. The documentation, to the extent it survives, hasn't been fully translated or analyzed in Western military history literature. But the decision itself, whoever made it and however it was implemented, represents something genuinely human in the middle of an industrial war that often seemed to reduce human beings to replaceable components. Someone looked at the data and said, "We can fix this." And they did. Let's now talk about the psychological dimension of the red hatch in a way that goes beyond the immediate practical function, because there is an argument to be made that the red markings served a purpose beyond helping crew members evacuate, that they served a psychological function during the time a crew spent inside the tank before anything went wrong. A tank crew in combat exists in a state of sustained tension that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced something similar. The external world is completely blocked from view except through narrow periscopes and vision ports. The noise is relentless. The motion is unpredictable. You know that at any moment a penetrating round could arrive without warning. You cannot hear it coming. You cannot see the round that's going to kill you. You just wait and operate and do your job, and try not to think about what a tank that has been hit from the inside looks like. In that environment, the knowledge that you know exactly where the exit is, that there is a clear and visible and unmistakable marker right there on the hatch, is a form of psychological anchor. It doesn't eliminate fear. Nothing eliminates fear in those conditions. But it reduces one specific source of anxiety, the fear of being trapped. the fear of not being able to get out if the worst happens. This matters more than it might sound. A crew member who is spending cognitive energy worrying about whether they'll be able to find the hatch release is a crew member who is slightly less effective at every other part of their job. A crew member who has practiced the exit so many times, whose eyes have been trained to go immediately to the red mark, who has a deep conditioned confidence in their ability to get out if they need to, is fractionally better at everything else. More focused, less divided in attention. In the compressed timescales of tank combat, where decisions happen in seconds and effective gun handling and ammunition supply can mean the difference between winning and losing an engagement, fractional improvements in crew effectiveness are not trivial. They matter. And the red hatch marking contributed to that crew effectiveness, not just in emergencies, but in the steady accumulation of every moment leading up to any emergency. Soviet engineers may not have articulated this in psychological terms. The language of human factors engineering and cognitive psychology wasn't the language of the Red Army in 1942, but the insight was there, operating implicitly in the decision to give the crew a clear reference point for their most important emergency response. It was the insight that a crew that knows it can get out will fight better than a crew that isn't sure. There's also the community dimension of this. Tank crews in the Red Army, as in every army, developed intense bonds forged in shared confined space and shared danger. A 4 or 5 man crew that has lived and fought together in a vehicle barely large enough to hold them, that has shared food and sleep and fear and boredom in that steel shell, develops a relationship that has very few parallels in civilian life. And within that community, knowledge about survival was shared obsessively. Experienced tankers passed on everything they knew to newer crew members, not always formally, not always through official channels, but constantly and practically. They talked about what to do when hit. They talked about specific vehicle quirks. They talked about which types of hit were survivable and which weren't. They talked about how to read the sound and feel of the tank to know when something was going wrong before the instruments told you. And they talked about the exits. Where they were, how to operate them, what you needed to do from each position inside the tank to reach each possible exit. The red markings made that knowledge transfer easier. When an experienced crew member showed a new man the exit procedures, there was something to point to. There was a physical, visible reference point that anchored the instruction. The new crew member didn't just have to trust their memory of a location described in words. They had a marked target to burn into their visual memory during training, so that it would be there, accessible, when they needed it in reality. This is an underrated function of standardized marking in any high-stakes environment, not just communication in the moment of crisis, but the facilitation of training and knowledge transfer in the time before the crisis. The red mark made the training more efficient. And more efficient training meant better prepared crews, and better prepared crews meant more people getting out of tanks that should have killed them. Now let's step back and look at how this Soviet approach compared to what other nations were doing with their tank interiors. Because the comparison is illuminating. The Germans, who in many respects built superior individual tanks, particularly later in the war with the Panther and the Tiger, took a different approach to interior design. German tank interiors were generally more finished. More attention was paid to ergonomics. The crew positions were often better laid out for effective operation. German tankers, who typically received more training than their Soviet counterparts, had a deeper technical understanding of their vehicles. German tank interiors were often painted in an off-white or ivory color, which reflected light and improved visibility inside the hull. This was a genuine improvement over dark interior paint for routine operations. But German tank design, for all its technical sophistication, was produced in numbers that could not match Soviet output. A Tiger tank required 5 times the manufacturing effort of a T-34. The crew conditions inside the Tiger were in many respects better, but there were far fewer Tigers, and the men who crewed them, for all their training and equipment quality, faced the same fundamental problem when their vehicle was hit: finding the exit fast enough. The Americans took yet another approach. American tank design, centered on the M4 Sherman and its variants, prioritized mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance to a degree that sometimes frustrated crews who felt the armor was insufficient. American tankers, particularly in Europe from 1944 onward, were acutely aware of the Sherman's vulnerability to German anti-tank weapons. The tank's nickname among its own crews was the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose slogan was, "It lights first time every time," a grim reference to the Sherman's reputation for catching fire when hit. American engineers responded to crew survival concerns with improvements in ammunition stowage, adding wet storage and moving shells away from the most vulnerable positions. They improved hatches. They worked on exit access. But the systematic approach to interior marking that the Soviets developed, born from Soviet experience with mass attrition and the specific problems that mass attrition revealed, was not a direct feature of American or British tank design in the same way. This is not a criticism of American or British engineering. It reflects different operational realities, different production philosophies, and different experiences of tank warfare. The Eastern Front was in almost every quantifiable way the most intense land campaign in history. The lessons it generated were lessons bought at a terrible price, and some of those lessons produced innovations that other nations arrived at more slowly or by different paths. The Red Hatch is one of those Eastern Front lessons. Cheap, simple, born from catastrophe, and remarkably enduring in its influence. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves careful attention: the question of what the red paint tells us about how the Soviet system, at its best, could learn from failure. Because the Soviet military in the Second World War was not a monolith. It was not always efficient. It was not always rational. It was subject to political pressures and ideological distortions that cost real lives in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. The purges of the officer corps in 1937 and 1938, which destroyed much of the experienced leadership of the Red Army, created catastrophic problems in the early part of the war that took years to overcome. But within that system, particularly at the engineering and technical level, there was a genuine capacity for pragmatic learning. The Soviets looked at what was failing and fixed it. Sometimes they fixed it slowly. Sometimes the fix came too late for the people who needed it. But the direction of Soviet military development across the Second World War is clearly one of consistent improvement, driven by a willingness to look honestly at what the data was showing and respond to it without being limited by preconceptions about how things should work. The red hatch markings are a small example of this, but a revealing one. They say something about a system that was, at least in this domain, willing to prioritize the survival of individual crew members, even within a broader strategy that treated individual lives as expendable in aggregate. The tension between those two things, the willingness to accept massive casualties as a strategic reality while simultaneously working to reduce preventable deaths through engineering and training, is one of the genuinely complex aspects of the Soviet military experience. It would be easy to say the red paint was purely cynical, a cheap fix to maintain the supply of trained crew members for an insatiable war machine. And there's an element of truth in that. Trained crew members were a resource, and keeping them alive long enough to train others and fight in other tanks had real operational value. But it would be reductive to stop there. The engineers who designed these solutions, the training officers who drilled crews on exit procedures, the analysts who pored over casualty data looking for patterns, these were also human beings, in a system that was also composed of human beings, who also did not want their colleagues and subordinates to die trapped inside steel boxes that were on fire. The practical and the human motivations were not separate, they were the same thing. And that's ultimately what makes this story worth telling, not as a curiosity about a peculiar Soviet practice, not as a data point in the technical history of armor design, but as an example of how human beings in extreme circumstances try to solve problems, how they look at death and try to make it slightly less inevitable, how they use the simplest possible tools, a pot of red paint, a training drill, a conditioned response, to push back against the enormous indifference of industrial warfare. The crews who climbed into Soviet tanks in the summer of 1941 and the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1942 and every subsequent season of that war were going into conditions that the human body and mind were not designed to endure. The machines around them were imperfect. The strategy was evolving through blood. The enemy was skilled and determined and often better equipped, and yet they got in the tanks. They sealed the hatches. They drove toward the enemy. And some of them, in the moment when everything went wrong, looked up through the smoke and the heat and the terror, saw a red mark on the hatch above them, put their hand on it, and got out. Because someone, somewhere, had looked at the problem carefully enough to understand that in that moment, a crew member needs one thing and only one thing. Not courage, not training, not technical knowledge, just a target, something unmistakable to reach for, something that says, this is the way out. That is what the red paint was. That is what it did. And in the long, terrible arithmetic of the Eastern Front, it was not nothing. It was real. it saved lives. And the people who designed it deserve to have that understood, even now, even decades later, even by people who will never climb into a tank and will never need to know where the hatch release is. The Soviet tank was a brutal machine built for a brutal war. But inside that machine, someone cared enough to paint something red. And that tells you something important about the people who built it, and about the people who trusted their lives to it, and about what it means to solve a problem when the stakes are not abstract, when they are the difference between one more person making it out and one more person who didn't. That's the real story of the Red Hatch. Not the paint, what the paint was for. Not the color, what the color meant. Not the engineering, the human truth underneath it, that in the worst circumstances imaginable, practical wisdom and simple solutions and genuine care for the people inside the machine existed alongside everything brutal and industrial and indifferent about the war. And sometimes, just sometimes, they worked.